Welcome to Vision Chats, where the only thing that matters is the future. I am Farouk Day, Vice Provost at Johns Hopkins University, and I am thrilled to be back for Season 3 of Vision Chats. I know it's been a few months since we left in December, but we're excited to start with a great lineup of guests and of visionaries who will talk to us and share with us their thoughts and their insights about the future in a variety of sectors. And the first guest to help us kick off the season is our colleague and friend and somebody we admire greatly, Kevin Kruger. Hi, Kevin. It's great to have you here.
Really great to be here.
Kevin, you are just a force to reckon with. You are the president and CEO of the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. You've been in that role since 2012. And prior to that, you've held a number of roles as Chief Operating Officer, CFO, and a bunch of other roles within NASPA. So you know this profession well, and you know higher education well. Prior to that, you've worked at Southern Methodist University, also in student affairs roles, and the University of Maryland, your alma mater, where you went to school. So you've seen higher education through a bunch of highs and lows, but I'm gonna guess that probably nothing like what we experienced this last year. And let me just paint the backdrop and just kind of get your reaction of what's going to happen from here on, what has happened, and what's going to happen. Obviously, we've been in a pandemic for a little over a year, and we're already seeing 140 million cases worldwide of COVID-19. So it's a disease, and it's a pandemic that has ravaged the entire world, not just the United States. 3 million deaths worldwide. Just here in the United States, close to 31 million cases, among them over 560,000 deaths. Just a tragic impact on us all. But there are some silver linings that we're starting to see. 40% of the U.S. population, or 15 million, has received at least one dose of the COVID vaccine. 8 million, or 22%, have received, are fully vaccinated, have received both doses, and we're starting to finally see the light of the end of the tunnel. But it certainly, to say the least, this has been a transformative year for all of us within higher education. We're seeing we've seen a paradigm shift in higher education in the work that we do. Students and faculty and staff having to learn how to work using technologies that have been around us for at least a decade, but now we've all been forced into this new paradigm. We've witnessed at least 7 or 8 colleges that have completely shut down, drop in enrollments in some universities and colleges, around 10 to 20% for many of them. And we're really at a turning point where we're starting to think of the future of higher education, of universities. Kevin, I'm wondering, is this the tipping point that we've talked about for a long time? That would be the impetus for major change in higher education?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so, but maybe not the tipping point for the kind of change that some people think. I guess maybe I'll say a little bit more about my perspective on that. But I was reminded of Andrew Yang when Andrew ran for president. But in the beginning of the pandemic, I think a few months in, he said something which really stuck with me. He said, in 3 months, we've seen 10 years of change. And I think now, as we're in like month 13 or 14, I think we could still say we've seen 10 years of change. And so I think the tipping point was, for me, was the role that the multiple issues going on in our country, not, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the racial justice pandemic that we are in the middle of. I think it served as an accelerator. I think and it's accelerated changes that we were seeing to some extent before the pandemic, and it has just rapidly moved us forward in some ways. What I don't necessarily endorse, this is my perspective, is that this is another one of those, this is the end of brick and mortar higher education as we know it kind of conversations. I know some people do think that, and it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. But I think that, if anything, what the pandemic has reinforced is the value of the in-person experience and how much that's valued both by faculty and staff, but also by students and stakeholders. So I don't see that necessarily, this is the end of that, and we're going to go to this entirely virtual kind of world. But I do think that the ways in which we do things are completely different. In fact, you could make the case maybe that the world we're living in today and the next year is just qualitatively different than the world that we were in January of 2020 before all this started. I mean, in some pretty substantial ways. And we can chat more about that, but I just think that's really the thing that I'm most interested in. I think about that simple equation of like what did we used to do that we're not going to do anymore. What did we start doing that we're going to continue to do, and then what's changing about the way we're going to do our business, and so I think about the sort of stickiness, like what's sticky about all this that we're going to continue. A good example is what we're doing right now. There's no doubt that we have discovered, and not just higher ed, but the world and major corporations, that we can be productive in an online environment that does not require us to be sitting in two comfortable chairs with the phone in between us. We can do it in a different way, and I think that reality is one of those things that's pretty sticky, that we're going to see different ways of collaborating, different ways of interacting, but without giving up the best of the in-person stuff.
No, that's true. And the evidence of what you just shared is in some of the discounts we saw in tuition in some universities. I mean, I think early on there was an argument from students for a lot of universities, especially the more elite and the more expensive ones, that, hey, I am on Zoom, but I'm not getting the full value of what you promised. So I should be paying less. And there was a debate for a while on whether or not that's true, because as a student, you're still getting that degree.
That's right.
But I think students were fairly quick to come back and say, hey, but that's not what you sold me in the brochure. You sold me community. You sold me connections with other students, with staff, that there's a whole student experience that can only happen in person, that is part of the value proposition, and that essentially, I think, made a lot of institutions finally realize the value of the co-curricular experience that happens outside of the class.
Absolutely. Yeah, all that, I have a end of one story. My daughter is a sophomore at the University of Maryland. So I've been watching her experience and all that. Very typical to how we've sort of seen others, the rest of the country. But one of the things that she talked about is it wasn't the online class that she objected to. It was the missed opportunity to meet with fellow students to study in the lounge, or to go over to the library or the academic building and have a study session, and the interactive things that I think that made that environment rich for her. And I think that's been replicated. We just see that across the country. I mean, I think that's what students have really, clamored for. I think I think it's, higher ed has so many different stories, right, Farouk? I mean, it's so it's even that that little one anecdote I just said, that's the experience of a full-time traditional age college student in a residential college. That's what her experience is. But I think we have to, we have to continue to acknowledge that, that's no longer the majority experience in America, right? And maybe in the world, that the non-traditional student, the student who maybe has children themselves, or they're older, or they're working full time. I mean, all those non-traditional factors are actually probably going to increase after the pandemic until we address some of these affordability issues. And for those students, the hybrid environment that we're going to be working on here is actually going to be more appealing, because there'll be some flexibility that will be allowed for some of the online experiences that we've gotten better at. If somebody said, and I hate to quote this and not credit them, but somebody has said, if you're in a lecture hall and once you're past row 7, you're basically in an online experience. Like, you're no longer interacting with the faculty member at that point. It's and so the whole idea that I think we've been talking about really for a decade of the flipped classroom, for example, let's really leverage our technology to convey information and use the time we have saved for the rich interaction between faculty and staff and students and that kind of thing. I mean, that's really the power. That's the learning experience. And in your area, I mean, you talk eloquently about how we help students develop these 21st century skills or cross-cutting skills. we're going to need that kind of rich in-person environment sometimes to develop those, particularly for adolescent age college students.
So I agree. There is also, I think, an opportunity for universities to recognize that while we go back to a fully in-person experience, that we might have learned enough in the last 12 months that there are parts of the university experience that can be done
absolutely
fully virtually
absolutely.
or close to that. So you're right. Things that have to do with community development and community engagement and meeting in the lounge and being part of intramural teams and student organizations and et cetera. All of those need the in-person environment. But there are so many administrative tasks that students will have to go through that in the past required that they go from one building to another, that they have to carve out time. And in the last 12 months, all they've had to do was just log in from their phone.
Right.
I think
think about I think there's also a whole suite of academic support dimensions that are actually more efficiently delivered in an online environment. And I think we've learned that for sure. Mentoring and coaching and nudging and different ways that we're kind of helping students advance.
Even advising.
Advising is a great example. I mean, I think I can't remember. I saw the survey, but I think students actually are more interested in a Zoom virtual advising appointment than they are going down to the advising office. And I think this really expands our reach for a lot of different things. So that's what I say. I think what's the future of universities? I think we're going to be better at what we do by virtue of this sort of imperative that we had to immediately launch into online. Into an online environment. I say that for student affairs folks in particular. I, just speaking to a group of vice presidents for student affairs, and when you didn't have the in-person, you had to suddenly really retool the way in which you engage students. Take recreation, for example. See, a recreation center is closed. What do we do with those staff? We can furlough them, we can lay them off, or we can have them think about how to engage students virtually. So I know it's kind of corny, but online Zumba classes and nutrition classes and wellness classes and all those kinds of things or seminars, the recreation staff quickly mobilized to do that. So when we go back to if classes are in person in the fall, do we give all that up? I'd say no. Why not add that to the portfolio of ways in which we interact with students? Some will be in the rec center, but maybe some will be online. And won't we, in the end, reach more students that way? And isn't that the best outcome?
Yeah, and April in the audience just commented that they have seen a drastic drop in no-show appointments because they are not virtual. And that's been our experience too. I mean, our engagement with students in my own division and with all of the work that we do has gone up by 400%.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think those are advances that we don't want to lose as we start to return to campus. I think the best way is to find where the value is for in-person activities, but where it has worked virtually, I think we should keep stepping on the gas.
You mentioned advising, but so I'm going to apologize if I overgeneralize here, but I know one of the challenges in the career area often is how do you get students to pay attention to career-related issues before their senior year, right? And there's this sort of story that you get people to come to the Career Center when you have free pizza, and then they come, but they come too late, and I think we've completely turned this on its head because this has allowed career offices and career development offices and the work you do to interact with employers and mentors and sort of that proactive work that we want students to do, because it is accessible on a virtual format in ways that I think that we could have done before and we were doing, but I think weren't getting as much traction as we had before. I don't know if you agree with that, Farouk, in terms of how students are engaging with your career center at Hopkins.
Yeah, so we have pushed with a couple of different approaches. One is to go more towards a content approach rather than transactional services. So we've actually really stepped back from the one-on-one advising and coaching model. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but we wanted to create enough of a culture so that it happens organically rather than through a clinical process where you have to schedule appointments, you have to come in. There's only one reason we did that, is because I knew that doing it through the strictly clinical model will only bring the people who have the navigational skills to navigate university.
Absolutely.
And have the courage and have the encouragement of the families, etc.
Sure. Yeah.
And what we saw is that the students who are of underrepresented backgrounds, first generation, limited income, and underrepresented minorities, were less likely to go through that very step-by-step process. Right. So instead, we decided to create a virtual content approach. We did that before the pandemic. So the pandemic was just created the environment for us to even go faster. And we're using digital ways, and we're basically building connections and communities and content for students. And through those engagement opportunities, I think we had the opportunity for students to engage with our teams. So that's been our approach the entire time. The pandemic has made that even more successful and more possible. So that was one of the silver linings during a tragic situation, and we're moving forward with that approach. And because for us, it's not about providing certain services and buying pizza to have students to come. We're not counting success by how many people show up to us. We're counting success based on the outcomes that they have during and after they graduate. And for us, anything less than 100% is failure, because it increases the chances for the underrepresented to not achieve those outcomes. So instead, we're just trying to really infiltrate the system and make it part of the curricular journey rather than a peripheral service that they have to go to and they have to be referred to. And then I think that's the difference. We've also pulled in other services. So for us, we're thinking for students to be successful, they have to be engaged in immersive experiences and mentoring relationships. So we've built these bridges and partnerships throughout campus with all of these different services that help students achieve that.
Yeah. I'm going to take the role of interviewer now, but I noticed on your we didn't plan this, by the way, folks, but this is how we're talking. I noticed both on your LinkedIn and your Twitter feed, you referenced a data chart from NACE about what kinds of experiences are most highly valued by employers. So this is consistent with what we've seen before, but number one, of course, is internships. And those kind of immersive experiences and the value of those. I guess, my question to you, maybe what you've seen or what you're hearing about, is one of the concerns that I worry about when we start putting an equity lens on this is who has access to internships, and particularly unpaid internships. And how do we ensure that, and this is sort of like a rhetorical question, but how do we ensure that the most privileged of our students don't continue to get the best opportunities through internships, and thus the best jobs, and then the students who, first generation students, as you indicated, lower income students who may have to work full time and can't do the internship, so a variety of students who maybe don't have that same kind of privilege. How do we ensure that there's more equity baked into that?
Yeah. This is where we can make a difference, is when we look at it from a systematic perspective rather than a transactional perspective. Transaction is we just, build these transactions and these relationships with companies and employers and just try to get the numbers, how many internships we have in our system. But systematic is if we recognize exactly what you said and then actually make the tough decision to say to employers, no, we're not going to help you recruit on campus if you're going to recruit students. And not pay them. And we go a little bit more gently about that. I've had many conversations with companies myself where they want our help to have them identify future interns, and they don't want to pay them. And it's really, I don't think it's because I think it's really out of habit. to be frank with you,
Yeah.
more than anything else, because in the past that was the thing. They had to pay.
You should be just grateful of having the internship.
Yeah, giving you experience. As AOC says, experience doesn't pay the bills, right? So what we tell, once we point out the equity issue, and we just say, look, if you don't pay, you're going to get the most privileged of our students, who have the ability to do your internship and not worry about money. That's right. Do you really want to do that? And as soon as we say that, they
say no, right? Well, and then the unintended. I mean, again, it's sort of understand the unintended consequences of doing that and what the downstream equity challenge would be. Like I think most companies in America have a very strong interest in recruiting a diverse candidate pool of candidates. Represent different races and ethnicities and genders and so forth. So I think, if they're engaged in a practice that has the alternative outcome, I think we have an obligation to kind of help educate them about what they need to do in order to accomplish those goals of literally recruiting a diverse class of candidates. So good.
Exactly.
You're doing good stuff in that regard. Yeah. So
this is a good transition to something that you mentioned earlier, which is the social justice pandemic or injustice pandemic that we're all having to face these days. I think, and I would assume that you probably think that this pandemic has existed for a long time. Probably what has allowed us to finally face it is technology, but also is that we had to sit in our homes, forced in front of TV screens and computer screens, and watch the whole thing. This is the first time that we were forced to see a Black man die at the hands of law enforcement, literally with a knee on their neck. And this is now why it feels like it's something new, but it has really been around for a long time. You're clearly passionate about making a difference in this area. I think higher education has a huge role to play here. What are you seeing in terms of trends? What are the conversations that are happening?
Well, the first is
all of these things.
Yeah, it's an incredibly complex. When you think about a social issue in higher education, of course, we are in a bubble sometimes, but we also, of course, sit in the landscape of what's happening in our country and the world. So that's what makes it, I think, more complex. I have a couple of quick thoughts, and we can dig into a couple of them. One is, we're struggling as a nation right now with the ways in which law enforcement interacts, and particularly with Black and brown people, and that's something that we are trying to grapple with as a country, but we're grappling with it in our campuses as well. There's just too many instances of campus police or security confronting a Black man, woman, Latinx person who might be somehow in the wrong place, and they're just going about their role as a student, and the kind of bias and racism that's embedded in that. So we've got challenges there. We also have challenges in terms of the militarization of police on college campuses that occurred since 9/11. And is that really the right kind of approach for working with the college student population? We've got to examine that. Actually, NASPA right now, we're in a process of doing some data collection around what's happening with campus policing, both from the institutional side. We're also asking students about their views of campus police, because I think we need to understand that a little bit, because it is a little different on a college campus. That's just one element. I think the biggest thing that I think about, though, Farouk, is we simply need to own up to and acknowledge and understand what the lived experiences of our students of color, in particular Black students, Latinx students, Indigenous students, non-binary students, GLBT students, have on our campuses, and what is their actual experience, and understand where we are and where we want to be, and how we can make changes to get to where we want to get to. I don't want to pick on college presidents, because that's unfair, but for the, I think, 5th or 6th year in a row, and it could be more than that, Inside Higher Education does this survey of college presidents. Theirs just came out about 10 days ago. And there's always a question there about race relations on campus. And here's what is consistent over the years, before George Floyd and now since then. Ask college presidents, are race relations on your campus good, poor, fair, good, or excellent? And about 2/3 or more of college presidents say that race relations on their campus is good or excellent. Wow, that's really interesting. But then you ask them the same question. You say, how would you characterize racial relations on college campuses across the country? And there you get about 2/3 who say it's fair or poor on other college campuses. So those numbers don't add up, right? You can't think you're the only one doing good work and everybody else is doing poor work, and every college, and 2/3 of presidents think they're doing good work. So what does that mean? What that means is I think we have work to do in simply understanding what the experiences of our students are to start off with. Because if a college president was sitting there and he actually had some climate information about how their Black students feel about their classroom environment, walking around campus, instances of racist experiences they're having, experiences walking in the stores in their town, if they had a better sense of that, I think they would come to a different conclusion and say, you know what, race relations on our campus are average or poor, and we need to do more work in this area. I've had multiple conversations with Sean Harper, who many of you know from USC, who runs the center out there, who's done some of the best work in this area. And one of Sean's frustrations is just this disconnect between what the students are experiencing and the staff to some extent, and faculty, and what the leadership of the institution might think is going on. So I think we've got a lot of work to do there. In particular, I think the other thing I would just comment on is as we come into the fall in-person experience, I think we have to acknowledge that our staff of color, our faculty of color, our students of color, in particular, our Black faculty, staff, and students, have just gone through what you just described over and over and over again for the past 14 months. Yeah. And the exhaustion, the anger, the fear that they bring with them to the campus. And I think we have some psychic harm that we're going to have to address as well. And I think the campuses should acknowledge that. Just in my own staff, I've got 60 staff and quite a number of staff of color and Black staff. And in my conversations with them, there are multiple days where someone would come to me and say, I can't work today. I gotta go. I'm overwhelmed by this, another Black person who was killed. And that psychic harm that's been kind of cumulatively done, I think we have to acknowledge that, and how are we going to repair that? How are we going to focus on that harm? How are we going to do the own work we need to do? And I'll say myself as a white privileged leader in student affairs, how do I kind of unpack my own bias and do the work I need to do to reduce some of the institutional racism that we have in both my organization and student affairs. So we've got a lot of work to do. And I think that it's going to get harder because it's getting politicized. Look what's happening in Idaho, where the state legislature has dipped into Boise State to say you can't do these courses and these programs around multicultural. That just, we're a polarized country, but boy, I think the politics is going to make this even more difficult to have these conversations. I know I'm kind of monologuing here, but the other thing is there was a survey I saw that talked about students' comfort level, or actually discomfort level, with talking about controversial issues, politics, race, gender, maybe sexual orientation could have been one of them. But there was like 5 or 6 topics that they almost 2/3 of students were uncomfortable talking about one of those, and that was one challenge. So students just having a difficult time having these challenging conversations about controversial topics. But the thing that really stuck out to me was, let's take race for example. I think it was like 47% of students who identify as Republican feel uncomfortable talking about race on campus with other students. And I think it was like 14% of students who identify as Democrat. Well, they were right there is one of the challenges. We just having a difficult time talking to each other about these issues. And not to get too grandiose about it, but boy, if we can't do this at the college experience, how do we expect Congress to do it? Or how do we expect it to happen in our neighborhoods? And we've got to figure out this way to kind of make that happen. And not shy away from those really tough conversations in the classroom as well as out of the classroom.
Everything that you're saying is so powerful and aligns so much with what universities need to do more of, which is create the spaces for these tough conversations. It is also true, I will just share my own personal experience, that I am one, and I think a lot of people feel that way too. I am one who is just tired of talking about it. And I even though I completely recognize logically that talking is the way, you got to get people to talk to one
Yeah.
another and to unpack this. But at the same time, it feels, I've been in higher education for 20 years, more than 20 years. And I can't tell you how many town halls I've participated in or been on a panel on, just like you have, or conversations that we've had as community, and where people are saying the right things, leaders are saying the right things, yet we're still dealing with this. It's still, and I often find myself at a point where I think, what is there to do besides talking about it? And I feel about that way about it. And I have had lots of conversations, and I know that my Black and brown brothers and sisters are absolutely exhausted of not only the issue of, but also of just having conversations about it. So I put some thought into it, and tell me what you think about this. But I really think that one of the issues in higher education is that universities are good at creating vision and strategy and plans, et cetera, for the future. And this is what the future of the university will be. And and we have to address diversity, equity, and inclusion, and DEI. We'll appoint a DEI, the chief diversity officer, who will help us do this. We will say all of the right things and put them in slogans and email signatures, and we will put them in our value statements. But it always feels like it's either an afterthought or a peripheral action item, that it's also, we care about research, and and of course we care about diversity, we care about teaching, we care about quality, we want retention, we want this, we want that. And I feel like until the day when higher education puts diversity, equity, and inclusion, embeds it into the vision statement, into the mission statement.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And into the full strategy, that everything we do needs to be the foundation of that needs to be equity and inclusion. And we have to constantly think about it. And we're constantly dismantling our own systems within universities because we have them. These are systems of oppression that we're not even aware of. Even something as simple as what we talked about earlier, of which student shows up to stuff that are not required versus not. And if you just look at the data, it's typically the privileged ones. It's not, and how are we wiring the entire university system so that these are not experiences that only the privileged ones find, and the other ones graduate and then discover them 5 years later. That's if they graduate. Those are just some simple examples, but it's beyond that. Are we really prepared to make the tough decisions in our faculty hiring? Do we have? I want to see representation in boards of trustees, in university cabinets. Until we get to that point, these conversations will feel hollow for a lot of us.
I think yes to all that. And I think I just say that there's no this is hard and it needs a kind of commitment that many institutions aren't willing to make. Frankly, I think that's what you're identifying. A couple of things come to mind. If we just took 20 college presidents, white presidents, because almost all college presidents are white. I think we're actually, the number of presidents of color is decreasing, despite the environment that we're in. But if we took 20 presidents from you name the institutions, doesn't matter. And close the door and put a cone of silence on that room and let people really talk. What you would find is a lot of discomfort, not about the importance of the issue, but their comfort in being able to manage this and do this in the way that would actually create progress. You hate to use the word competency in this space because, and again, I'm going to quote Sean Harper again. Sean, will say like, well, you don't want your doctor to be just competent. You want them to be an expert, right? So competency is such a low bar. So we say cultural competency, right? But we do need the leaders of our organizations in higher ed and outside of higher ed, whether it be the CEO or the second level tier or leaders in general, deans, to be able to have complex conversations about race about gender identity, about sexual orientation. We need that environment to occur, and some acknowledgement, particularly for those of us who are white and in power, to acknowledge that privilege that comes with being a white person in that space, and so that you got to start there, right? You got to start with that as one place from a leadership standpoint, and let's stop kind of marginalizing DEI work as something that is sort of this add-on that you mentioned. It has to be integrated into the work that we do. And how about if we hold ourselves accountable for some measures of success in this area? Like here's an example. Like if you're a campus and you take and do the effort to understand what the cultural climate is on your campus, whatever that is, poor, awful, horrific, mediocre, okay, whatever it is by some measure, and you have some targets about where you want to be in 3 years, hold yourself accountable for improving the culture and the climate on your campus. Hold yourself accountable for hiring faculty who are non-white. Hold yourself accountable for some of these for measures like real equity goals around completion. What if the 6-year graduation rate of your Black students, your Latinx students, your Indigenous students, your low-income students, your first-generation students, you name the equity category, if those 6-year graduation rates are the same as the rest of the students, great. If they're not, what are you doing, and are you holding yourself accountable for closing those gaps? I think we need that kind of accountability, and frankly, boards of trustees should be holding us accountable for that.
Yeah,
I think so. Anyway,
why? This is a question I've always had. Why do you think it's so difficult? It shouldn't be, but why is it so difficult to increase our hiring of diverse candidates for faculty roles? I think we do better in staff roles.
Yeah,
but faculty.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bit of a. One of the challenges certainly is the pipeline of candidates who are coming in. So if you want a diverse professoriate, that means you need to have more PhDs, more master's candidates coming out who are of color, and because those are the folks you're going to hire. I harken back to my days at UMBC with Freeman Hrabowski, who still is on this mantra, which is, the Meyerhoff Scholar Program. He brought all these students in initially, and they were initially Black men. They became broader than that, but they came in with essentially commitments to go get a PhD in a STEM field, like that kind of vision that you're actually trying to expand and create opportunities for young scholars to advance to a PhD so that they can become part of the professoriate. And that's you have to have that kind of vision. Right now, I think I don't know that it's gotten any better. I think we're kind of in an arms race here where the most privileged institutions either steal or poach or attract faculty of color in order to diversify their professoriate, but leaving the regional institutions and the small privates, the non-elites, with not the same kind of resources to be able to do that. So I think that's not necessarily the solution. Not to pick on Hopkins, but Hopkins can get anybody they want. If you want a diverse faculty, I assume you have one, should have one, because you can afford it. And that means if you have to go to X, Y, and Z institution and make an attractive offer, you can do that. That's a privilege that comes with a place like, or any of our elites, frankly. But I think the challenge is a little greater as we think about how do we do that in a broader way. And it's so powerful. Look, I have the privilege of never having to worry about who my faculty were or my staff was interacting with. But the experience that students have of going to a campus and not seeing anybody or not enough people like them to even think that I can get there, and that is really debilitating and it's powerful. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to deal with this. But look, I don't want to Pollyanna this either. Like, so it's not just the availability of candidates. Some of the barriers to getting candidates, faculty of color, is because institutions aren't making it a priority. Right. So can you, if you don't have a search where you're actively trying to identify candidates, of color to come to this to be part of the search, so you have folks to choose from. If you just let it kind of happen, it's like, oh, we didn't get any diverse pool, so we're just going to go without that. That's maybe in today's world, that's just not acceptable any longer. To advance a search without doing real work and trying to diversify the pool. Not to say you always hire the diverse candidate, but at least have the pool look like the students that you're serving?
I agree with all of that. I think also that part of the issue is that hiring within university ranks, especially for faculty, is decentralized. Yeah, so human resource departments will give the guidelines, the setup, the infrastructure, but the departments are free to hire who they want and what they want, so we can provide them the training for be multiculturally competent recruiters and hopefully supervisors after that, because it's not enough to hire them, but you got to retain them and make sure that they thrive, which is also an issue. But I think what happens is, at the most, I think human resources have pushed departments to at least have diverse pools, and perhaps the departments will achieve that. But then what happens once you get the candidates, and how do your own personal filters as a recruiter play into that? Let me share with you a quick story that is not related to hiring faculty, but I think it can be relevant. We tried to do a specific program at Johns Hopkins to allow work with companies to recruit underrepresented students. So it was a big diversity initiative, and we had a lot of companies that raised their hands and said they're interested. We gave them the resume books of those students. We created the infrastructure for all of that, and we were surprised early on to see that after they reviewed the candidates and they met with them, many of them came back and said, I'm just really not finding the talent that I'm looking for. I don't think they even realized what they were. And we had to do some work. I had to have some incredible members in our team who actually walked these companies through and had conversations with them, student by student, to try to point out the skills that they have. And eventually we were able to turn that around gently, without being accusatory. But you see, I think a lot of people don't realize, especially if they're come from privileged backgrounds themselves, they don't realize their own baggage, as you mentioned earlier, and it shows up.
Unconscious bias is a powerful factor that we're dealing with. Huge. And to really, look, it takes really concentrated work to challenge that, address it, to own it, and to make some progress in that area. And I think that it's not enough organizations, companies, campuses are taking that work on. You're right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's
absolutely. And I would add accountability to it too, which is really hard in higher education settings to do, especially in academias. So I want to switch back to student affairs administrators and practitioners and even scholars. They have gone through a year of paradigm shifts and seeing, this is from the frontline staff who work in residential life and residence halls to student activities, athletics, etc. And they've seen their work. I'm sure there was a time when they were afraid if their work will exist in the future. So now we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. How do they reposition their own skills and their own selves? And, but it's changing. Yes, we are coming back to our campuses, but their work is changing. How do they reposition themselves? What are the skills that they need to have? What does the future look like for
good question.
Profession?
Yeah. Well, let me just let me just acknowledge a short-term issue first. And that is for anybody here who has been working the past year and been on campus in particular. We have this misnomer in America and probably globally that all campuses were shut down. And of course, that was never the case. We may have gone to virtual learning, but there were still students in the residence hall. We had international students. We had students who were housing insecure. We had students who didn't have a safe place to go. For a variety of reasons, that we still had students in the residence halls. That's one piece. And then as we de-densified, more students came back, of course. But we've been open the whole time. When I say we, I mean higher ed for the most part. So let me just first acknowledge anybody who has been in that sort of situation. Nobody signed up to be a frontline person dealing with a major pandemic in that way. And that is something we just need to get said. These people have done heroic work. I mean, you had the quarantine residence halls. Who's delivering food? delivering mail, making sure these students are safe and taken care of. I mean, like that. There's a lot of personal risk that people endured through this, and I think we should have to acknowledge that. So that's one kind of transition we have to kind of get through. For those people who are doing it online, like the rest of the world, we are all exhausted by this. Fewer people, more work, being on Zoom the whole time. So I think that's another thing that we're going to have to grapple with going forward. The impact, I think, for student affairs is, I would just comment on two things. One is we have a lot of burnout in student affairs right now, and I think that probably extends to other parts of the campus as well. We don't have data on this, but there's a lot more anecdotal information about people leaving the field, that they just, I don't want to do this. This is not what I signed up for. Whether that's generational, I mean, the late millennials or mid millennials who are grappling with some of the work-life balance issues that are difficult in student affairs, or the nature of the work ended up being not what they'd hoped it would be. And that's something that we should be paying attention to. Now, future. I have a line, some of you have ever heard me speak in my speeches, and I've been saying it before the pandemic, and now I'm saying it even louder, is that the age of specialization in student affairs has to come to an end. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean that we don't have departments. I don't mean that you don't have recreation and housing and conduct and activities and union and career development. And I don't mean that. I mean that the modern campus now is going to demand staff have generalizable skills to do more than just what's in their department. That's going to come as a result of increasing complexity of the demands that are placed on us, and fewer staff. Because I think the other thing that we have to kind of grapple with, Farouk, is that the budget implications of COVID, both the short and long term, are going to be challenging for every campus to deal with. And I think there's going to be some constriction of positions that are going to exist. We've already seen that in the faculty. In many campuses where we're losing adjuncts and departments. We're going to see the same thing at the staff level. So that's certainly one to think about. So those generalizable skills, I think, are going to be more and roles are going to be more and more important. I saw somebody that popped up on the chat, and yes, I think one of the things we're grappling with in higher ed is pay. Particularly in student affairs, we have people working at a barely minimum living wage, and that is something we're going to have to grapple with. The old idea. This is how I came up in student affairs, and back in the day, way back. You get your master's, you work in whatever field, whatever part of student affairs you work in, and you work 50, 60-hour weeks. You don't get paid anything. And you do that for like a little while, and eventually somehow you get paid later on downstream. That doesn't work for this generation at all. And I think we have to stop the intergenerational warfare of saying like, oh, you young people aren't willing to work hard. I think we need to stop that and acknowledge that pay is a substantial issue for young professionals in our field and in higher education, and we need to have some sort of strategy for how we're going to increase the pay scale. That's hard in tough budget times, but I think if we don't do that, we're going to start losing our best people to either student affairs adjacent fields or out of higher ed or out of something like this at all. And I think that's a really critical thing. And I will tell you that the young people in that I interact with, and when I say young, I mean entry level, early mid level. They've been screaming at us about this for the last 5 years, way before the pandemic. And we keep, us boomers in particular, keeps like, no, we're not going to deal, we're not going to listen to you. I think we're doing that at our own peril. We're going to lose our best talent if we don't address this issue. Having said all that, I think, what else do we need in terms of what the future is? Well, one, I'd go back to what we talked about in intelligent social. Every single person who works in higher education has to do the hard work to be able to manage and deal and think through difficult racial and identity issues with their students and on campus. And it means do your own work and be able to do that. That is a core competency now for us. And I think the other thing I would say is, as we go forward, is that the challenges that higher education faces in general really do kind of come down to these equity gaps that we see in higher education. It's like, who's completing and who's succeeding and who isn't. And we have got to close these equity gaps that are so persistent in higher ed. And frankly, the pandemic is making them worse, right? We haven't even talked about this, but the drop in Latinx enrollment we're seeing nationally, the fact that enrollment from high school to college from what they call high poverty schools, low income schools, and high minority schools. And I apologize for the language. We wouldn't necessarily use that language. That's the federal government language. But the enrollment from those schools is way down compared to the high income, low poverty and non-minority schools. We're making this, that whatever progress we saw a few years before the pandemic, we've erased. So we have this whole generation of students that didn't go to college because they're working full time or their parents lost their job. And who are they? They're Black, brown, low income, first generation. We got to figure out a way to get these students back into our institutions, because otherwise we'll have had a whole generation that will be lost to the economic opportunity that college provides. So in that regard, I think, back to your question, like student success, what are we doing to help ensure that barriers are reduced and that we can facilitate degree progress, persistence, and completion for, low-income students, first-generation students, and students of color. That ought to be our mission. Everybody who works in higher education should have that as a key part of their responsibility. I've said, like, my student affairs colleagues, let's say you're a hall director. You can be a hall director, but why don't you also have a cohort of first-generation low-income students that you're mentoring? And have the advising toolbox technology to be able to do that effectively. Everybody can't be Georgia State and hire 150 advisors. So, where are those people? Well, they're working on your campus. We need to think differently about those roles. And that's the generalist idea that I think I keep talking about. And many campuses are actually starting to implement.
Do you think that student affairs has a branding problem that perhaps will keep it from
forever? Yes.
That keeps it from achieving this?
As hard as I try as the president of NASPA to overcome. Yeah. So I'm going to tell you a quick story. I have this. This is not a real story, but it's a made up story. So there's a faculty member sitting in their lab. Okay. All right. And you pick the campus, and they're labbing away, doing their stuff, right? And they're doing their thing. And there's other labby people doing their thing. And there's a window, and then out the window, and they look outside. This is pre-pandemic. And they look outside, and there's some people putting some tables up and blowing up some balloons. And somebody says, who are those people? Oh, that's the balloon blowers. That's the student affairs people. Now, that's not a real story, right? Because the balloon blowing actually is setting up the involvement fair and the opportunity for students to engage with each other in student organizations. But the idea that we are balloon blowers, that we are the kind of fun and games people, is the branding problem that we have. And I think that we have an opportunity, and I think we've made progress over the years. I'm certainly in that regard. But I think we have an opportunity to continue to reinforce how we contribute to the outcomes of the college education that we all value: 21st century skills, persistence, completion, job acquisition, all that, and then we do that through our curriculum, which is engagement and real life experiences and leadership and developing communication opportunity, all those kinds of things. So we could do a better job, but we've done an okay job there. But that is the branding challenge we have, is like helping people understand that. In the pandemic, most colleges depended on their student affairs people to manage all this stuff. I mean, we've been at the center of all this. But I really always worry about when we sort of like are waving the crisis management flag, because that's what we do. But we also have to wave the student success flag as well, and the racial equity flag, and the other kinds of things that we are really experts at, and the role that we play on campus in those regards. So, but we'll always have a branding problem, and and I spend before the pandemic, I spent all my time on an airplane talking to provosts, presidents, CIOs, attorneys. I mean, anybody I can talk to talk about the value of what we do. Now, it's different now in the pandemic, but because of that very issue, because I felt like it was my job to try to be, to evangelize about the value of what we're bringing to the college experience.
Well, I think words can be really powerful, and and the words we use to refer to student affairs professionals and practitioners, and how we describe them not only in job descriptions but also in titles and conversations on college campuses, even at a national level, can make a big difference. I've always thought of student affairs practitioners as educators.
Educators, absolutely.
More than administrators. They're not administrators, they're not practitioners. They can be all of those things, but more importantly, they're educators. And I think if college campuses start, especially after this pandemic, because my biggest fear, Kevin, is for the pendulum to swing back after this COVID crisis. We've had a year where we've realized the value of the outside of the classroom experience, which is largely managed by student affairs folks. The pendulum will swing back, and then they will be viewed on many college campuses by some of their counterparts as administrative bloat, and that shows up in budget conversations. That shows up in priorities. So if we're now realizing it, is there a way to have this national campaign and conversation about moving the brand to for student affairs practitioners to be educators and to be paid as such and to be treated as such, and an organization like NASPA could make a big difference in that area.
Well, I think we're not just in student affairs, but what happens when you have constrained budgets is that you really, it's not a bad exercise to go through institutionally. It's like, what are we doing that actually is contributing to the outcomes that we identify as key outcomes for our institution? And how do we measure that? So I think, look, we have to also take some responsibility as student affairs educators and leaders about ensuring that we have the data, both assessment data, predictive data that underscores the value of what we do. I've had several high-profile vice presidents say to their own people before the pandemic, if you can't demonstrate that what you're doing makes a difference in these set of outcomes, then we're probably going to eliminate your job in your department. So, that's an imperative that we also have. And we're going to see that, I think we're going to see that played out, not just in student affairs, but across higher ed, about how we, in difficult budget times, are going to have to underscore the value of different functions that we have, and what the priorities are for the institution. But we have some work. We have some work to do in that space that we have to own. Also, we can't be victims in this. It's like, oh, faculty don't pay attention to us. Well, then make them. Make the case. Make your case.
Well, and they do now. We are in a moment in history where they do.
Yeah, and they do. If there's one refrain that you hear over and over again about on this, that folks talk about is, the silos on campus, right? Faculty over here and student affairs over here, and lifelong annoyance at that. But there's the reality is that we do need to find ways to find that integration. And if you're a student affairs person in this audience, that if you just sit back and wait for faculty to come to you, that's not going to happen. They're busy being faculty. So we have to also find those ways to integrate and connect to faculty. That will also help the cause a little bit as well. So
yeah, absolutely. Kevin, how did you get into this line of work? What I
was an RA when I was an undergrad, and I was going to be a social studies teacher, 10th grade social studies, and I did my student teaching, and I realized that 10th graders weren't interested in social studies. So I had to do a quick pivot after I already had, was getting the other to leave. And my hall director, this guy, Lenny Travaglioni at the University of Albany, I was like, how do you get to do this work? And that was how I got into it. And then I really wanted to be a vice president of student affairs. That was my vision. I was almost there. And then I got drawn into this association world, and I've never regretted staying out. I'll be in my 26th year at NASPA. And I love the fact that we're grappling with big problems, and these that require big solutions. And although I loved campus-based work, I loved the idea that I get to say every day working on things that are like what's happening in this major enterprise called higher education that plays such a critical role in our society, right? Here and also globally. So it's cool. It's cool work.
Very good. From one former RA to another,
there we go.
You're doing an amazing job at inspiring all of us. My last question to you is, if you can imagine the future in one image or one word, what would that be?
Equity is the word I have. Just plain equity. And that we have, that higher education will help solve some of the persistent problems that we have faced in our society around equity, around race and sexual orientation and income and first generation status. That we are the hope for that, right? We are the true hope for that kind of equity in our society. And if we can model that way and do that and make progress in that space, we'll have literally change the world.
Fully agree, and I think that that's our greatest work moving forward. Kevin, this has been a fascinating.
Yeah, we're going to use another hour, Farouk. It's goes so fast.
I know.
I just noticed that I see like it's all this chat. I wasn't able to really keep up with it all. Thank you all for all of you who engaged in the conversation with each other and questions, that kind of thing. I'd love to, if you can capture that chat, get a chance to see what we're talking about. And thanks to all of you for dialing in. I love this show. I love the format. You're doing a great job, Farouk.
Thank you so very, very much. I learned a lot from it, and I learned a ton today, and I learned from all of you. So thank you all so much for being with us today. And remember, the only vision that matters is the one that you create. Thank you all. Blessings.